This morning, State Police and Fort Wayne Police arrested 49-year-old John Miller. Investigators say he confessed to the crime. Miller now faces charges of murder, child molesting, and confinement in a case that's terrified the Fort Wayne community for decades.
This video covers the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of a child. Some details are difficult. We've kept the description to what's necessary to understand the case. Viewer discretion is advised. It started to rain that afternoon. Not hard. Just enough that a mother told her daughter to grab her umbrella before she left the house. That single ordinary instruction, the kind every parent gives without thinking twice, is the reason a little girl was walking alone on a quiet Indiana road on the afternoon of April 1st, 1988. She never made it home. 3 days later, a jogger found her body in a ditch, 40 feet off a rural county road. For 16 years after that, someone kept taunting the police who were hunting for her killer. He left notes. He left threats aimed at other children. He even left his own DNA over and over like he was daring anyone to catch him. It took 30 years, a stranger's spit sample in a genealogy database, and a trash can outside a trailer in Grabille, Indiana, to finally put a name to him. This is the case of April Tinsley. If you're new here, this channel covers cold cases that got solved, the ones where science finally caught up to evil. Subscribe if you want more of these. April Marie Tinsley was born on March 18, 1980. She grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and by every account, she was the daughter her mother Janet had always wanted. Janet later said she'd once dreamed of having a little girl with blue eyes and curly blonde hair, and she got two. One died young. April was the one who lived, and Janet said she loved shopping trips and sleepovers at her grandparents' house. April was in the first grade. Teachers and neighbors described the same girl over and over: sweet, well-liked, the kind of kid who didn't have an enemy in the world. Her uncle, Jim Tinsley, was especially close with her. Years later, he'd describe how deeply she was loved in her short 8 years, and how the loss never really faded, that even decades on, it still felt closer to yesterday than to something a quarter century old. April 1st, 1988 wasn't just an ordinary Friday. It was April Fool's Day, and it also happened to be Good Friday that year. Kids were let out of school early, around 11:30 in the morning. April had lunch with her mom, then asked to go play with a friend down the street. Janet told her to be home by supper time and to call as soon as she got there, and April did, like always. A neighbor watched her walk toward the alley where she'd crossed the street. April turned around once and waved before she disappeared from view. April was a rule follower. That detail matters because it meant something was seriously wrong the moment 3:30, then 4, came and went, and she still wasn't home. Here's what investigators pieced together. April and her friend had been playing nearby. Around 3 o'clock, the girls split up to head to different houses. Partway home, April realized she'd left her umbrella behind, the same umbrella her mother had told her to bring, and turned back to get it. She never made it there. Janet called the friend's house first, hoping April was just running late. She wasn't. That's when panic set in. Neighbors and family spilled out into the street yelling April's name. By 6 that evening, with no sign of her, April's parents called the Fort Wayne police. Janet gave officers a photo and described exactly what April was wearing: a blue turtleneck, a pink and red jacket, light blue pants with 3 hearts stitched on one leg, and pink shoes. Remember, this was 1988. There was no internet, no cell phones, no Amber Alert system to blast her description across the state in seconds. Search efforts ran entirely through newspaper, radio, and television, and through manpower. Fort Wayne PD brought in K-9 units and their mounted patrol, officers on horseback, to cover ground the old-fashioned way. A combined task force of roughly 25 officers and a 50-person volunteer search party spent 3 days combing a wide radius around her neighborhood. Then, on April 4th, a man out jogging along a county road in DeKalb County, the county just north of Fort Wayne, looked into a ditch off the roadway. He saw a young girl. She was deceased. This video isn't going to describe the physical details of what was done to her, beyond what's necessary to understand the case. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled, and the cause of death was ruled suffocation by strangulation. Investigators also determined something disturbing. Her killer had removed her clothes and then put them back on her before leaving her body in that ditch. Investigators noticed something else strange. Her body hadn't been buried or hidden. It was left out in the open, close to the road, like whoever did this wanted her found. One of her shoes was missing entirely. It turned up later, a few hundred yards away on the opposite side of the road, as if it had been tossed from a moving vehicle while the driver sped off. Police recognized immediately how important that shoe was as a piece of evidence, and they kept the detail tightly guarded from the public. That detail, a killer who didn't seem to want to hide his crime but did want to hide himself, would define this case for the next 30 years. Within days, the community rallied. 2 local radio stations set up reward funds. A memorial service drew around 150 mourners to a local church. And in time, a garden would rise near where she was last seen. But that's a story for later in this video. Within days, a motorist reported seeing a blue pickup truck parked near where April's body was found. Then a second witness came forward. She said she'd seen a young blonde girl with hearts on her pants walking near where April vanished, and that a blue pickup pulled up beside her. The girl hadn't seemed scared. The witness assumed it was a parent picking up his kid. The truck and the girl were simply gone moments later. It's an understandable mistake. Most of us have seen a child get picked up by an adult and not thought twice about it. Police released a composite sketch based on that description. A white male in his 30s, roughly 150 pounds, with sandy, wavy hair. Fort Wayne panicked. Tips flooded in, and one name kept coming up. A local man with a nickname who resembled the sketch and had reportedly been scaring kids at a nearby park. Rumors spread that he was tied to a group with occult connections, and for a while investigators seriously worried April might have been the victim of some kind of ritual killing. There was no solid evidence for any of that, just speculation feeding on itself in a frightened town. The man didn't own a blue truck, though he had access to one. A witness picked his photo out of a lineup, but that was the extent of the evidence against him. He passed multiple polygraph tests. Weeks of suspicion built up around him before detectives were finally able to rule him out entirely. The case went cold. 2 years later, in May 1990, a man called police to report graffiti scrawled on his barn on Schwartz Road in northeast Fort Wayne. The message referenced a detail that hadn't been widely publicized, the missing shoe, which is exactly why investigators took it seriously instead of writing it off as a copycat. Crude and misspelled, it claimed responsibility for April's murder and threatened to kill again. The FBI believed whoever wrote it may have deliberately disguised their handwriting, either to hide their identity or to throw investigators off entirely. Crayons were recovered near the barn, but they carried no usable fingerprints. The trail went cold again, this time for 15 years. In 2004, a young girl in Fort Wayne found a note tucked in the basket of her bicycle. It claimed to be from April's killer. 15 days later, a second note turned up in the bicycle basket of another young girl, similar in age and appearance to April. The baskets held more than notes. Polaroid photographs, graphic and vulgar sexual content, and, in at least one case, what the sender called a present, a used condom. By leaving that condom, the killer had unintentionally handed investigators a large, usable DNA sample. But when they compared it to the DNA preserved from April's clothing back in 1988, the results suggested a possible match, without being conclusive since DNA science was still developing at the time. Analysts ran the sample through the FBI's database of convicted felons. No match came back. Whoever this was, he had never been caught for anything else. This wasn't a hoax, though. It was confirmation that April's killer was still out there, still watching children and now taunting police directly, daring them to catch him with evidence he was practically handing over. Police increased patrols. Families were put on alert. One tip stood out from the rest. A man called police and accused his own father of being April's killer, someone who lived close to April's old neighborhood, who had a documented history of child molestation, who owned a Polaroid camera, and who'd once owned a blue pickup truck that he repainted just days after April's murder. The caller pointed to specific phrasing in the notes that sounded to him like his father's writing. When questioned, the father volunteered that he remembered exactly where he'd been working on the day April disappeared, an oddly precise memory for something 15 years old, and detectives flagged it immediately as a red flag. When they followed up with his former employer, They learned he hadn't actually been at work that day or on the day April's body was found. A search of his home turned up a notebook and a camera that matched details from the case. For a moment, investigators believed they'd finally found their man. His DNA didn't match, not even close. The case reset once more. By the mid-2010s, two new Fort Wayne detectives, Clint Herrick and Brian Martin, had inherited the case. Advances in DNA science had let them narrow their suspect list down to somewhere between 12 and 15 men, people who, for one reason or another, had refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample to investigators. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it was suspicious enough to keep those names on file, waiting for the technology to catch up. Here's a quick explanation of what changed everything, because it matters for how this case finally cracked. For decades, investigators only had one real tool for matching crime scene DNA to a person: running it against a criminal database and hoping the perpetrator had been arrested for something else before. If he hadn't, that DNA sample would have just been a profile with no name attached to it. A dead end, no matter how many times you tested it. Genetic genealogy works differently. Instead of checking criminal records, investigators upload an unknown DNA profile to public ancestry databases, the same kind of sites regular people use to trace their family trees. Even if the suspect himself never took a DNA test, a cousin, an aunt, or a distant relative might have. From there, genealogists build out an entire family tree working backward from those matches, then narrow the list down using age, location, and physical traits, until only a small handful of candidates are left. It's the same method that identified California's Golden State Killer earlier that same year, 2018, ending a manhunt that had also gone unsolved for decades. In early 2018, that news coverage reached Detective Martin, who wondered whether the same lab, Parabon, might be able to do for April's case what it had just done for the Golden State Killer. Investigators submitted their DNA sample to Parabon. 7 weeks later, they got a phone call. The lab had narrowed it down to two brothers, both still alive, both living relatively close to the area. From there, detectives did something almost old-fashioned. They pulled the brothers' driver's license signatures and compared them, by eye, to the handwriting on the notes left in those bicycle baskets years earlier. One brother's signature was a close match. His name was John Miller. This is the part of these videos I always find the most satisfying. Decades of nothing, and then one DNA match cracks it wide open. If you're enjoying how this case comes together, drop a comment with your theory before I tell you what happens next. I read everyone. The trigger here wasn't a confession, a lucky tip, or a dramatic chase. It was garbage. Detectives decided to wait for trash day. That night, after Miller's bin was set out at the curb, they pulled his trash themselves. Going through the bags, one detective found a used condom. Then another. Then a third. 3 used condoms in total, recovered at 4 o'clock in the morning. He drove them directly to Indianapolis to get them to the state's DNA analyst. 2 days later, the results came back. It was a match. John Miller's DNA matched the DNA recovered from April's clothing in 1988. Remember that shoe? The one thrown from a moving truck 30 years earlier? The detail no one outside the investigation should have known? That same instinct to leave things behind, to almost want to be caught, is what finally gave him away. He left DNA at the scene in 1988. He left DNA and threatening notes in 2004. And in 2018, he left the DNA in his own garbage, setting it out on the curb like anyone else's. Detectives went to Miller's home. When they told him they needed to talk about the Tinsley case, he didn't ask what they meant. He said her name himself. One detective later said he was genuinely surprised Miller volunteered it before they'd said it to him. Miller wouldn't come right out and admit what happened, not at first. Detectives pressed him. They had the DNA, they told him. It had narrowed the list down to him. He'd already admitted to it himself in a way through the letters and the condoms he'd left behind years earlier. Eventually, he confessed. News of the arrest spread fast through Fort Wayne, and a lot of people, including April's mother, publicly said they wanted Miller to face the death penalty. Janet didn't hide how she felt. He had taken April's life, and she wanted his in return. Despite the DNA match and his own confession, Miller initially pleaded not guilty. A plea deal followed months later. In December 2018, he pleaded guilty to murder and child molestation. Judge John Surbeck accepted the agreement. 50 years for the murder, 30 more for child molestation. 80 years total. Prosecutor Karen Richards, visibly emotional throughout the hearing, told the courtroom that what Miller did had made an entire community lose its sense of safety. She had declined to pursue the death penalty, against the wishes of April's family. The sentencing hearing was packed, standing room only, family members wearing shirts printed with April's photo filling the first rows. April's cousin read a statement directly to Miller, telling him she used the word human loosely when she talked about him. Miller's own attorney read a brief statement on his behalf, apologizing to the Tinsley family and the community. Janet was the last person to speak. She read her own statement and asked Miller the one question she'd been carrying for 30 years. Why her daughter? Why April? His answer when it came wasn't a story or a justification. He said he was bored. That's it. That's the entire explanation a grieving mother received after 3 decades of waiting. One more update. For anyone who's followed this case closely, according to Indiana Department of Correction records, Miller's earliest possible release date had been set for July 2058, when he would have been 99 years old. He never came close to that date. In September 2025, roughly 7 years into his sentence, Miller died in custody of natural causes at 66 years old. In the years the case sat unsolved, the community built something of their own. At the intersection of Masterson and Hoagland Avenues, near where April was last seen, friends, neighbors, and total strangers created April's Garden, a memorial space where people still leave messages of support for the family decades later. There's a bench there now. Janet still visits it. She said that when she's having a hard week, she goes and sits and talks to April like she's still listening, telling her that her mother misses her and wishes she was still here. It rained that afternoon in April 1988, just enough for a mother to hand her daughter an umbrella and tell her to be careful. April went back for it. That's the whole reason she was alone on that road at that moment when a blue truck pulled up beside her. 30 years, 3 separate rounds of taunting letters, 1 wrongly suspected man, and a garbage can outside a trailer in Greville. That's what it took to answer a question that should never have taken 3 decades to solve. And when the answer finally came, it wasn't even a reason. It was one word. Bored. If there's one thing this case proves, it's that DNA doesn't forget, even when investigations stall for years. The technology just has to catch up to evidence that was sitting there the whole time. So here's what I keep coming back to. If a killer leaves pieces of himself behind for 30 years, in a ditch, on a barn, in a bicycle basket, in his own trash, how many other unsolved cases out there are just waiting on the same kind of match? If this case affected you, let me know in the comments. And if you want to see how this same DNA technique cracked the Golden State Killer case, or the Carla Walker case I covered a few weeks ago, I'll link that video right here.